Mr. Chairperson and friends, I'm very impressed by the empirical richness and the methodological rigor of the paper, as all of you must be. But I must say I'm very shaky in making a comment on this paper because, the basic analysis is through principal component analysis. You have collected information from the ground, from the skies, combining them and also relating the first principal component, which is taken as the composite index, with different dimensions which have gone into it. Since I've done some work on this, I know that there are at least 60 varieties of principal component analysis. And unless I know exactly what is the nature of the correlation matrix, what are the interdependencies among different component analysis, I came across a fantastic statement from Curitin, 1955. He says that every principal component analyst believes the other variety of principal component analysts are insane. And the only remedy for them is my variety of principal component analysis. Really, I'm not really commenting on this paper because I personally feel that this is a rigorous work. One has to find out that how the correlation matrix was constructed, what were the weightages that went into it, and how do you really take up the individual dimensions which have gone into the construction of the composite index and then work out the relationship. But I would like to comment on 3 or 4 propositions that are part of the analytical framework and also are emerging from this analysis. First, basically 3 issues, and on the last issue, I would like to engage the chairman of IGC also into the discussion because I think he has made significant contribution in this measurement of slums issue, which has unfortunately not generated much heat, but has substantial amount of light in that. Slum data in the Indian statistical system is like, Cinderella's, she doesn't get the attention. It's the employment, consumption, expenditure that get all the attention. So let me briefly comment on these 3 issues. First, Emily, you're talking about massive urbanization at the global level. I mean, that's, if that is indeed true, that if the world is experiencing fantastic high rate of urban growth, how come the target of 50% world population being urban was achieved in 2009 and not in 2006, which was predicted? How come world urbanization prospect in every year is revising the urban population of India and of Asian countries downwards? Because actually there is, in the Asian context, they are not repeating what Latin America did in the second half of the last century. I think one has to examine this, and if somebody says, well, Indian definition of urban is very, very stringent. I've looked at the world urbanization prospect, which give the definitions of different countries. I must tell you that 55% of the countries have more stringent definition than India in terms of employment, density, and criteria, and I think 45% have less. So I'm not very convinced that the definitional factor would be there to support the proposition that Chinmay raised about slowing down of urbanization in the Indian context. That is one thing. Second, which I really liked about this paper, is following UN Habitat's definition of slums, the security of tenure has been brought in. Unfortunately, in the Indian definition of slums, we have population census, collecting data on slums, national sample survey collecting data on slums. We have never tried to include the security of tenure because that's a very, very difficult issue to ascertain at the ground level. Right? You go send your NSS enumerators or census enumerators. It's a very, very difficult proposition. We have other things, access to water, access to sanitation, quality of housing. I was talking to Professor Mathur that how road becomes a sign of quality of housing, but nonetheless, if there are access factors involved and also the congestion factor, they are all there in our definition. But security of tenure is not there. I was just wondering, why is it? We had recently in Mumbai a discussion on the 69th round, and we were impressed to find that 75% of the urban population in India reports having security of tenure. Either they are living in rented houses with proper documentation, or they have land title. But by the way, the enumerator cannot ask, can you show the document? When they are going there, the person who is responding in the slums is worried that this information might go somewhere and I might be denied of this facility and that facility. The information that you gather, and that's what we are trying to find out. In the slums, 60 to 70% of the people reported having land title. The point is, if that was really so, why under Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, there are problems in implementing the program, because program said 70% should be in situ upgradation, 30% should be resettled somewhere else. It was the other way around. It was even difficult to settle the slum dwellers, even 30% in most of the cases. So I have a feeling that collecting data on security of tenure and making it a part of definition is something which is difficult, but this is something that we should be working on. I was chairing a committee in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. They asked us to work out a slum vulnerability index. We tried to do some exercise of defining the criteria of tenability. We have submitted the report. Partho was also a part of the committee, but somehow that has not come even into the public domain. The ministry is still considering it, whether they should do that. But I think this is an extremely important thing. How do you really bring in security of tenure, and how tenability is to be defined? That I think is extremely important. But I'd like to tell you that Indian census data on slums have serious problems. Started in the 81, 91, they did not collect. Census Registrar General or the Director of Census Operation did not collect the data individually from the household level. They asked the municipal corporations. She said, can you tell what is the slum dwelling population? It was only in 2001 that actual census operation was done to collect the information. Right? But there what happens? Many of the states say we have no slum. Those states which know that perhaps the slum data may be useful for allocating funds, they said, yes, we have very high percentage of slums. In fact, I'm quoting from the Director of of Census Operation in Madhya Pradesh. He says, we traveled through Durg and we found many slums. But since the municipal corporation has said no slums, we have reported that data. So, that was in this 71 situation. Now, a large number of states still do not report slum data, and a large number of urban centers do not report slum data. NSS has been designed to collect information on the slums and not actually on the household. There is a household schedule also canvassed along with the slum schedule, and there is some information. Do you ask to the household, do you think this is a slum-like condition? I found that the information in two different schedules, if you add it up to obtain the figure of the total slum household, they are very, very different. They are very, very different from the census also. So, considering all these problems, one should ask, the cities which are reporting no slums, do they actually have no slums? Or because they have not understood it, or there are some other reasons. There are some states which have not reported slums even in 2001. What should we do about that? Considering this major issue, a committee was set up under the chairperson of Dr. Pranab Sen to find out how do you make the data system reliable. It's a phenomenal responsibility that they had, and what they did is very, very impressive. They said, look, we cannot take the data which are reported by the census in 2001 because these non-reporting cases, if you take them as zero, then you are certainly underestimating. This is the point that you are making, that official census data are really not capturing the situation. So, if I'm making any methodological error, you will just tell me. They used a regression model to find out, based on certain characteristics, you can find out what would be the total slum population. And I find that exercise very, very interesting, useful, because it really tries to resolve the problems which are there in the official statistical system in some way or the other. Now, the estimate, if I recall correctly, for the total urban centers, the projection, the estimated slum population was 75 million. And if you take only the statutory towns, it was 70 million. Although the census actually had reported, I'm talking about 2001, census had reported only 62 million. Why I'm mentioning, Emily? Because you did mention that slums are growing at a very rapid pace. If you take the NSS data, you do find that the percentage of slum population with the inadequacies it's gone down from 23% to about 19%. I'm talking about the census data on which a systematic effort was made to look at the data set and create some comparable data. And although census 2001 had reported 62 million people living in slums, Pranav Sen committee applied a socio-economic model to really remove this problem of non-reporting errors and estimated the slum population in the total urban areas as 75 million and 70 million in statutory towns. 2011, and for 2011, the projection was 93 million. And now, results of 2011 census is out. And the figure is nowhere near 93 million. The figure is 65 million, which means if you take that figure of same committee, that statutory towns have 70 million slum dwelling population, and 2011 census is restricted to only statutory towns, there is a decline from 70 million to 65 million. I have a feeling we have to have another committee, and we again need the services of Professor Pranav Sen. Thank you. Pardon me? No, no. In fact, if you talk about census 2011 census has followed exactly the same definition, excepting the fact that in 2001, they had gathered information only from class 3, class 4. They have not included that. And at the request of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, the Registrar General of India conducted a special census for the towns which are below 50,000. And what I have done, I have added all that together, and that also comes to less than that. I have a feeling that systematic thinking needs to be done as far as the slum data is concerned. Since you gave me one more extra minute, by asking that question, I would like to say that I think this rate of flux that exists in the slum data is not just a random factor. I think there is a strong vested interest in keeping the data on slums in this state so that you can have vision documents and stakeholders can come in and implement their project without really addressing the basic issues of access to water supply, sewerage, sanitation to the slum population. Thank you.
5 minutes. 5 minutes for questions. I can see one hand being raised before you. I'll go. Yes, please. Yeah, you. Yes.
And I found it interesting.
To the speakers first, not to the discussant.
What's your problem?
Worried that
the question will be to the chairman also.
No, I'm not worried about it.
Means I'm just trying to point out towards the existing thread of research that's happening, because there is existing interesting results that's coming through the agricultural productivity and natural growth rate. And you find that there is a negative relationship. Higher agricultural productivity leads to lower natural growth rate. There is existing kind of thread of literature that talks about resource scarcity, women empowerment, and women fertility, actually. So there is no theory as of now in this work, actually. It's like complete descriptive. Means if you have pointed that it's natural growth rate that's affecting urbanization through agricultural productivity, you need to have a theory, actually, that what determines natural growth rate. I'm just trying to point out towards kind of existing work that is there. And this work has been recently popularized by Alberto Alesina of Harvard, actually. They published something in QJE in 2013. From there, they try to figure out that the community which started plowing and the community which has different kind of agriculture, they have a different set of fertility rate. So there is a resource theory which can be traced to look for the natural growth of, you can say, natural growth rate and fertility, and possibly somebody can link it to the kind of urbanization that we are seeing in India. So that is what I'm trying
Thank
to
you. Here, please. Yeah. No, the mic here, please. The mic here. Sorry.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I have a bad throat, but the question goes to the first speaker, and very good presentation with a very white canvas. So just trying to look at the reasons for urbanization growth and not, not growing, I mean, both the issues. You specially mentioned demographic differences. And you had mentioned other things, but you again identified demographic difference. But you said low yield in agriculture is also a very big driver on that, right? And then low yield and high population growth in the rural sector. That's what I could trace. So there's low yield, high population in agriculture, I mean, in the rural sector, and low population growth in the urban sector. Ultimately comes down to that in my point of view. And that you're saying is not leading to urbanization. In some sense, then you're saying that there is no migration from these low yield agricultural regions to the urban sector. And that sort of, I mean, at least in my mind, that sort of contrasts certain other studies or ideas that we have, is the cyclical migrations and seasonal migration. So when you talk about migration, there's different, I mean, definitions of migration as well. And in India, this completely the cyclical and seasonal and huge level of migrations happening in that kind of systems where they don't bring the family, but lots of people migrate and then go back. And so how do you capture that migration? And then when you say that there is no urbanization, I feel that if there is a huge poor people migration happening, that would lead to a sort of different kind of migration that leads to the second paper, I think, of a slummish urbanization, which means an impoverished urbanization. So it's just my thoughts that is it completely non-migrate, I mean, non-urbanization, or is it different kind of urbanization that's happening?
5 minutes. 5 minutes for questions. I can see one hand being raised before you. I'll go. Yes, please. Yeah, you. Yes.
And I found it interesting.
To the speakers first, not to the discussant. उसके बाद भी
Worried that the question will be to the chairman also.
No, I'm not worried about it.
Means I'm just trying to point out towards the existing thread of research that's happening, because there is existing like interesting results that's coming through the agricultural productivity and natural growth rate. And you find that there is a negative relationship. Higher agricultural productivity leads to lower natural growth rate. There is existing kind of thread of literature that talks about resource scarcity, women empowerment, and women fertility, actually. So there is no theory as of now in this work, actually. It's like complete descriptive. Means if you have pointed that it's natural growth rate that's affecting urbanization through agricultural productivity, you need to have a theory, actually, that what determines natural growth rate. I'm just trying to point out towards kind of existing work that is there. And this work has been recently popularized by Alberto Alesina of Harvard, actually. They published something in QJE in 2013. From there, like they try to figure out that the community which started plowing and the community which has kind of different kind of agriculture, they have a different set of fertility rate. So there is a resource theory which can be traced to look for the natural growth of, you can say, natural growth rate and fertility, and possibly somebody can link it to the kind of urbanization that we are seeing in India. So that is what I'm trying
Thank
to
you. Here, please. Yeah. No, the mic here, please. The mic here.
Sorry. Hello. Yeah, sorry, I have a bad throat, but the question goes to the first speaker, and very good presentation with a very white canvas. So just trying to look at the reasons for urbanization growth and not growing, I mean, both the issues. You specially mentioned demographic differences. And you had mentioned other things, but you again identified demographic difference. But you said low yield in agriculture is also a very big driver on that, right? And then low yield and high population growth in the rural sector. That's what I could trace. So there's low yield, high population in agriculture, I mean in the rural sector, and low population growth in the urban sector. Ultimately comes down to that in my point of view. And that you're saying is not leading to urbanization. In some sense, then you're saying that there is no migration from these low yield agricultural regions to the urban sector. And that sort of, I mean, at least in my mind, that sort of contrasts certain other studies or ideas that we have, is the cyclical migrations and seasonal migration. So when you talk about migration, there's different, I mean, definitions of migration as well. And in India, this completely the cyclical and seasonal and huge level of migrations happening in that kind of systems where they don't bring the family, but lots of people migrate and then go back. And so how do you capture that migration? And then when you say that there is no urbanization, I feel that if there is a huge poor people migration happening, that would lead to a sort of different kind of migration that leads to the second paper, I think, of a slummish urbanization, which means an impoverished urbanization. So it's just my thoughts that is it completely non-urbanization, or is it different kind of urbanization that's happening?
Chair, I must say these are excellent papers, both in terms of the richness of what has been done. I'd really like to congratulate IGC. I have been following some of the work that has been done in the past in urban. So I have one for each person. The question that I have for Emily is, you know, it's related to this PCA, but even before that in the data, having worked a lot in slum upgrading for many years, did you take electricity for granted? And what about the assets? Because in terms of distinguishing, I mean, there are transport assets, bikes, motorbikes, etc. There are telecommunication assets today. I mean, there have been a lot of people saying, in terms of both policy and in terms of mobility of people within, it seems to have cooking stoves, energy is a big one. And I think, so do those figure in any of your indices? And I'm just reminded, the first time I went, this was one of your pictures, I went on a World Bank mission as a young professional. I really put my foot into it because I went on a slum upgrading project. And of course, I asked where the slum was, because the places we were going to were better than the places I lived in Lucknow. So, and those were considered upper middle class colonies. So I mean, that just reminded me of that. Your paper was actually very, very good too, but it's the question related to the previous one, which was, I'm not quite sure the mechanics of this relationship or the mechanism of agricultural productivity. And if you sort of disaggregate it a little more, perhaps in terms of having a model of stepwise migration or differences in the migration patterns, which you allude to, are, and especially in the last decade, when you look at, for example, you find IT, I don't follow the sort of implicit big story. And in that sense, but I must say I'm very, very thrilled to see your paper, because 3 years ago I presented a paper at the Stanford India conference just on the basis of IT, and the last top 40 cities which were seen as above 1 million, and a conjecture, a speculation was that the IT cities was where the pattern of some of the stories were very clear, but perhaps they were different from the other cities. But what you're saying is that holds for all 350. I find that difficult because 90% of the IT activities in 6 cities. So I'm wondering where there's some spurious numbers there.
I guess we have to stop it here now, but we'll give 1 minute each to the speakers. Professor Tumbe?
Yeah, very quick. Hello. Yeah, regarding theory, I'm well aware of Allison and actually Esther Bosurup's work, which first propounded that. We actually don't find it, because simply if you look at that, classic divide, even Haryana and Punjab are zones of low female autonomy, but they don't exhibit the demographic divergence. The theory out here is very simple. It's called the fertility-induced effect, the income effect on fertility. Becker, 1960. So that's the theory that we are following here. On low yields and you're right. Regions with low yields should have more migration. Broadly, we do find that Bihar, UP, low yields, we find a lot of migration. Madhya Pradesh, we don't. There's a historic migration network which is linking these migrations. We have a paper published last year on the different types of migrations. So yeah, I would sort of advise to look at that. The last one on IT, what we look at is not the quantum of IT investment, but the workforce share in IT. It's very different. And so we find this sort of variation across these cities.
So I kind of smiled when you asked about whether we took electricity for granted, because electricity is an issue that's pretty close to my heart. Before starting my PhD, I worked for 2 years in Bihar on electricity policy. So I'd certainly looked at the electrification data. Something that's quite interesting is when we looked at electricity rates, most people actually report that they have access to electricity, and it's, again, it's mostly informal. It's mostly hooking on to the line. But it's really hard to get clean data on that, because if you ask people if their connection's official or not, everyone says it's official. So we ask about metered connections, but I also saw, when I was in Bihar, that even some of the official connections don't have meters. So it's messy, and we are looking at it, but no, it's not in our asset index. As far as transportation assets, I think this is a really great point. In the index, we include bicycles, we include motorbikes, we include auto rickshaws, we include cars. But I mentioned that not only do the number of assets increase along this continuum, but also the type. And that is something that I want to look into further as we refine the methodology. That's certainly something that I've seen anecdotally as well on field visits, that those kind of at the top, like the photo I showed that also looked quite similar to the apartment building that I lived in Patna. We saw cars everywhere, but when you go to lower places on the continuum, even if some of the housing structures look quite similar, you see different types of transport assets. So yes, we will be looking into how assets differ as we move forward. We look at those as well. Yeah, we look at 22 different assets. And then as far as the security point goes, the 10-year security issue, we also are really trying to look at 10-year security in our work, and I agree that it's very hard to do that because it's not a clean binary, do you have it or do you not? We're trying to think of it actually more as a continuous variable, but it is something that we're looking at, not actually including in our scoring because we think it might be something that causes slums to be at different places on the continuum, but it's certainly something that is tricky and that we're looking at.
That brings to a close of the morning session. You would all agree that we had a fantastic and very productive morning, remarkable papers. Please join me in thanking and give not really a hug right now, but certainly congratulations to both the speakers. Can I make 2 points? Can I make 2 points? The tea is over at 12 o'clock. We started late, no problem. On Dr. Tumbe's paper, the conclusion that is coming is that the pace of urbanization is unlikely to be picked up in the near future. And all those who keep talking about rapid urbanization, their wishes or fears, they are unlikely to come true. The worrisome part here is, Dr. Tumbe, that the role of fertility is declining. The role of migration is also is declining in a sense, the figures that Amitabh gave. What is not declining is the transformation of rural settlements into urban. Is that the new form of urbanization that we are going to see in the country? And if that is the case, then certainly the government needs to be informed of this new form of urbanization. They seem to be somewhat unaware that we are going to have a different form of urbanization. I do not know whether India would be an outlier compared to other countries that you covered, but that seems to be the case right now. Amitabh also brought in the old sort of controversy about over-urbanization. That was a talk of the 60s and the 70s. Now it seems to be the case of under-urbanization. And I do not know where the balance really lies. Just one comment on your paper. I mean, your paper threw up two very interesting points. One is the slums are increasing, but our knowledge base with respect to slums is not increasing at all. We continue to look at slums the way we used to earlier, and our knowledge base is very, very poor, number one. The second point that she's raising is by notifying slums, we are really not making any impact on their service, on the service levels, or on the assets at all. So notification is a very neutral kind of a factor in the levels of services in slums or the level of assets that the slum households have. Also, you also referred that there has been no secular improvement, and the improvements are very, very spotty. I don't know what really is going on in the slums, that some parts get improved, but other parts do not get improved. It's a very fearsome kind of a scenario that we seem to be getting from the analysis that she has presented, as well as the kind of future of urbanization that Dr. Tumbe has said. But thank you all once again. Please join me in giving a good hand to both the speakers and the discussion.